obviously the man who needs no introduction because he didn't give me one. Thanks, Bruce. I've always wanted to be introduced as the man who needs no introduction, but you literally just didn't give me one, which I think isn't the same thing. That's not the same kind of infamy. So hi, I'm Martin. How's everyone doing? I'm going to take you right through till the afternoon break, so you've got about 4 hours, if that's okay. I hope you brought your packed lunch. Now you've got about 20 minutes. It's quite an interesting time at the moment. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of panic, and I thought, I like this, hopefully you like it. I've called me talk the tax invasion. So where this came from is I put something on Instagram the other day and I said, what do people want me to talk about? None of you gave me any ideas. Thanks for that. I obviously haven't got the fans that I thought. But anyway, one person said, it always confuses me the difference between tax invasion and tax avoidance. I thought, well, you are confused because it's tax evasion, of course, not invasion. But I wonder whether that was like a Freudian slip because, of course, it feels like we're just under attack, doesn't it? It feels like we're under... So, yeah, we've got some nods there. We're off. We're on common ground here, sir. So I thought it was worth just covering off, for what it's worth, my thoughts, 30 years in the tax industry, what we've seen before, what could happen, things you might consider. None of this is advice, of course. We can give advice, but this isn't advice. This is just speculation and thoughts. So what's likely? Well, there's been a lot of talk about capital gains tax, and I'll call that alignment. I'll come on to that. There's a lot of talk about people's homes falling into tax as well as their houses. I don't know how close this has to be. I'm conscious that I'm like, no, is that all right? Can you hear me, yeah? Is that a yes or a no, sir? That was just a hand. That was an okay, thank you very much. So, homes as well as houses, there's been speculation about possible capital gains tax if you inherit a family member's house and all of these things. I'll talk about that a little bit. There has been a lot of talk about some reliefs being too generous. So what are these reliefs? Who do they apply to? Most of them won't apply to you, but I'll cover them off anyway because there might be the odd person. And then stamp duty land tax. So I'm just going to go through and give you my thoughts. So what does capital gains tax alignment look like? Well, at the moment, income tax goes up to 45% for higher rate taxpayers. There are moments as your income grows where you can pay way more than that. And landlords can actually pay more than 100% tax on personally owned resi properties with mortgages if you're a high rate taxpayer. Capital gains tax at the moment, though, was just dropped to 24% for higher rate taxpayers. The talk of alignment, quite simply what that means is to income tax rates. Okay, so what we've got is a lot of people at the moment who, let's say you've got £100,000 profit built into a property. The term is pregnant with gain, by the way, if you want to know, but don't wait 9 months to sort it out. So if you've got a property with a pregnant gain in it and it's 100 grand, at the moment, if you sold and crystallised that gain, you might pay £24,000 tax. The talk is you might pay as much as 40 or 45% tax. Okay. Quite interestingly, I did think about putting like a little chart in for the history of who brought in these reliefs. A lot of the reliefs that are now too generous were actually brought in under Brown-Blair, under New Labour. So it's quite interesting that we've clearly got a different Labour, which is one of the questions I've put on there. Which Labour do we have? We don't know. What we seem to have is someone leading what someone else called a tax invasion. So yeah, like that, and we are definitely on their radar. What's interesting is the rate only parted from 45% under Labour. And what they did is they said, well, pre-Brown and Alistair Darling back in the day, what happened was your properties went up in value, and of course some of that was just inflation. The value of money changes over time. So a 100 grand house in the 80s that you sell for 200 grand in the 90s or the 2000s, a lot of that uplift was just inflation. People's wages went up, they could afford to buy bigger houses. It didn't really mean the house had doubled in any other sense other than through inflation. If you'd added value to it or property went up above inflation, there was also a bit of real gain, but a lot of it was just inflation. And I think just for context, if you had a house you bought in the 80s through to now, it would have gone up something like 7 times in value, largely just because inflation did that. It isn't really anything else. So what they said is we're going to get rid of what was called indexation allowance. Anyone older will remember this. I feel really old now because I remember this passionately. It's part of who I was back in the day. And what you did is you said, well, I've owned this property 10 years, and there was a calculation to work out the inflationary bit, and you got a credit for that. This guy remembers all of this. He's great. He's nodding along. At least I think he's agreeing. He might just be nodding. I don't know. Happy days. They were the days. So you didn't pay tax on the inflationary element of the uplift in the value. Labour said this is all really complex, and it was a bit complex. How about we get rid of the inflationary relief and we just tax you less? And it was simple, beautifully simple, and that's where we got the lower rates. So they brought in something called non-business asset taper relief. And the longer you owned the property, the smaller percentage of tax you paid on it. And that was quite simple for a while. And then that went, and we ended up on a rate. Where are we today? 24% for high rate taxpayers on resi properties. It's nice and simple. What's interesting is if we go to 40%, you will again be paying tax on the uplift, unless they bring in a relief to reflect the uplift for inflation. So that 100 grand, that becomes 200 grand. If you lose 40% of that down the line, you're paying tax on inflation. So I think that will be a deterrent to people to sit on properties if we've got a reasonable amount of inflation going on. Even modest inflation over a lot of years adds up. Homes, by homes I mean the houses you live in, your homes. There is talk about ending the tax-free growth in your own house value. I'm not sure that anyone is, I'll just say, silly enough to really go for that, because that will alienate basically everyone who owns a home. And it would also then be a real kick for people who aspire to own their own home, I think. What we've then seen is these fairly complex suggestions that if you inherit somebody else's house, at the moment, when you inherit that, your base cost for tax purposes is the value you inherit at. So this, I usually pick the audience, but in this example, someone's going to die, so I won't pick anyone. If my auntie, who isn't in the room, who isn't Elaine, sorry Elaine, I nearly killed you off there for mere entertainment. I shouldn't do that. If my auntie passes away and leaves me a house, not the first time, yeah, sorry Elaine. If my auntie leaves me a house, there might be inheritance tax. That's dependent on the value of her estate, not the receiver. There's been suggestions that when I sell that house, because I didn't pay for it, I should pay tax on the value of the house. Now, there's been a long-standing thing in tax that you don't get charged to 2 types of taxes, okay? So that was theoretically chargeable in my aunt's estate. It might have been under the threshold and therefore not incurred a tax charge, but it was actually chargeable to inheritance tax. If I then pay capital gains tax, that's the definition of 2 charges. So again, I don't know how they can really do that, because if they do that, that's just taxing your home by the back door. You're just not here to see it anymore. But it's still happening. It's still taxing your main residence. So what they might do is they say, well, we're not going to tax your auntie's house, but any investment properties, we're going to tax them then. But again, the same logic has to be defeated. It's already been liable to inheritance tax. How can you charge that uplift again? Okay, so it's quite a complex one to do, and I think there's probably easier ways to get money that will be politically easier on the public, but possibly tougher on us. So if I was them, I wouldn't go anywhere near homes. I would leave that for another day. I think there's easier wins. Unfortunately, we are the wins, okay? And as I've said there, which Labour do we have? A lot of the reliefs we've got were brought in by old Labour, or new Labour, sorry. I don't know what we call this Labour. I'll just call them this Labour. Inheritance tax, again, there's been talk that the reliefs are too generous. There's probably, well, there's a relief that applies to everyone in the room, but there's 2 that might not. Some of the reliefs that they think are too generous are around passing on businesses. So anyone who's got a business, and I don't mean a property business, that's investment for most tax purposes. If you've got a business like you have a shop that sells stuff, or your factory that makes things, or you're a letting agent who hasn't been closed down by Susie's team, then that business can be passed on. And at the moment, you've got some fairly generous reliefs. I can give shares in my business to someone, and I can hold over the tax, and they only pay the tax when they sell. I can also pass a business on for inheritance tax purposes. And again, they'll only pay tax if they've sold it before I die, or it's no longer a qualifying business. What this allows you to do, though, is generationally pass the business down without losing 40% every time you do it. Okay? The same logic, by the way, is the reason why you can sell your home and not pay tax. If every time you moved house you had to pay tax, the next house would be smaller, wouldn't it? Which, again, is not very aspirational. So that would stop people moving. Which, to be fair, stamp duty already does. Once you get up the thresholds, you pay some pretty hefty stamp duty. If you also had to pay 40% on any uplift as well, I don't know, would probably end up with a market like Spain, where there was, Amjad might know about, not suggesting you were involved, Amjad, but in Spain, anyone who's bought a property in Spain, we used to get clients say, oh, well, there's two prices. There's the contract price, and then there's the bag bit that goes over or under the desk. You'd end up getting artificial valuations done, and it would be a nightmare. So again, I think that's easier to avoid. There's talk about this relief for businesses is too generous. There's also business property relief in agricultural. Again, farmers can do this to a degree. If they get rid of that, again, what's the incentive to get into business? If when you grow it, they're going to tax it at 40%, and if you pass it on, they're going to tax it at 40%. And if you die, they're going to take 40%. All of these feel anti-business, especially when they're business reliefs. NRB is the nil rate band for inheritance tax. You'll all have a general concept that you only pay inheritance tax once you're worth over 325 per person. There is a little bit of a relief for people with big houses. That could be something that goes, because why should people with more houses, or bigger houses, get away with paying tax? We'll see. SDLT, absolutely no idea what they could do here, but there's already good economic arguments for why SDLT is a deterrent. It stops people moving houses. If you want to move house and you're selling a £500,000 house and you want to buy another £500,000 house, there's a canny bit of stamp duty that's going to affect both ends of that transaction. That we already have a lot of reliefs and exemptions that have already been kind of curtailed and dismissed. There's probably a couple in there that wouldn't hurt the market too much. We've also got a lot of additional stamp duty charges that apply. We'll all be aware of the additional 3% for additional properties. That also applies to companies. If you're a non-resident purchaser, there's an additional 2% on top as well. If you buy a home you're going to live in through a company, you can pay 15% stamp duty plus annual stamp duty. So there's already been a lot of really heavy-handed stamp duty rules. I'm not sure there's much to be gained here, though, because it doesn't actually raise that much money, to be blunt. Neither does inheritance tax. So if they're unless they're overplaying the size of the deficit, there isn't much to be done here. If I didn't care about any of you and I was advising Auntie Rachel on what to do, like Auntie Rachel, I've stole that as well, that wasn't mine. The Auntie Rachel's tax invasion, that's all stolen plagiarism. I would probably bring in Section 24, but for companies. Now, what is any of this? You might not know what any of this is. Section 24 is probably the main reason why most people started buying their residential properties through companies. Yeah. It famously, I think it was Sherry Blair, was it, Amjad, who tried to say it wasn't fair for individuals? Tried the judicial review? Someone nod there? No? No one nodded? Someone said, yeah. Oh, it's you, sorry. I'm looking. It's this late. I can't say a thing. So, when Section 24 came in and said individual landlords are going to get restricted tax relief on interest if they've got resi properties, mortgages, etc., a lot of people just went, we're going to move to companies then, because companies still get full relief on their mortgage interest. So George Osborne, when he brought this in, said, too many people are buying houses. You're stopping homeowners from buying houses. And what we've seen is the personal purchase of buy-to-let properties is still slowly going up. But then limited company purchases, of course, just took the place of personal buy-to-let property purchases. So it didn't really slow the market down at all. It just increased everyone's admin complexity, rates they pay on all of the mortgages. If they really don't like residential landlords, which I think is a reasonable assumption to make, this would certainly have a big impact. What would it look like? If it looks like the residential version for individuals, it would mean you wouldn't get corporation tax relief on your interest in full. You would get half of the relief, and you'd all be back in the same boat that you tried to get out of. I spoke to someone out there, I think it was called Grant, hopefully he's in here listening. He's basically looking at where he should buy his next property. At the minute, I would say, for the sake of 5 weeks, you may as well wait and see what happens. If you are where you are, there isn't a massive amount you can do. What can you do, though? So, literally 2 minutes left. A lot of people are currently working on crystallising their gains. What does this mean? Well, it means if you've got that 100 grand house I talked about, and you can crystallise a reason for the gain to come into charge before the budget, you can get that out of your system at 24%, and someone else can get a refreshed base cost, so the future growth will be at the new rate. Okay? Now, there aren't that many ways you can do this without losing control of the asset in some way or incurring quite a bit of money and costs. So I would say these are only really worth doing if you're already thinking of passing on an asset in some way, or if the gain is huge and the variance is huge. Because don't forget, there's like a game theory idea in politics and economics that you warn people something really bad's coming and then just don't do it. But the tax take goes up because everyone panicked and did it anyway. Yeah. So the problem we've got here is I pass this house onto a lane, I crystallise the £100,000 gain, I pay 24 grand capital gains tax, and the rate doesn't change. I've lost control of an asset and paid 24 grand for nothing. So we're in a bit of a sticky wicket. There are ways to do it though and keep control of the asset. I wrote a blog on this the other week. So if you look up, there used to be a thing called bed and breakfasting for capital gains purposes. Someone's nodded and said yes to everything. Can you remember that one, sir? Bed and breakfasting? Yeah. What you could do is you could sell an asset and then just buy it back, and you washed out the capital gain. They stopped you doing that because it was quite artificial. So what people can do now is they can do something called bed and spouse. This is a family show. What this means is you might sell and your partner might buy. The asset is still in the family unit, but what you've done is you've refreshed the base cost. You've still lost the 24 grand, mind you, in that example, but you still as a unit own the property. It's tricky. Don't do any of this lighthearted. There is a lot of things you can get wrong. If you haven't got a spouse and you need to sell it and buy it back to refresh, you've got to wait at least 30 days. If this is a property, that's quite hard. It can't be in limbo out there. If this is stocks and shares, though, it's quite easy. All you're doing is you're gambling the movement in the share price, which, of course, is a commercial risk. You've got to be careful. If it's stocks and shares, you can do something called a bed and ISA. You can sell them and you put the money in your ISA. Your ISA buys the shares. You can wash out gains that way. Or you could bed and SIP. You might, though, say, well, I still want to control the asset, and I was thinking about doing some planning anyway. Put a property into a trust. You can hold over capital gains into trust, but you don't have to. So you could volunteer to get this 24 grand uplift, put it in a trust for the kids, the grandkids, still control the asset. The problem is you've lost the income because you can't keep your hand on it and have successful planning. You could go into a company, but I would put a big asterisk on that. Section 24 for companies would make them quite an interesting proposition. And of course, you could just give it away. But again, you've lost it. I am willing, though, to accept any property gifts from anyone in the audience today. I'm slightly over. I do apologise. Sorry, is that my first house? Thanks, Bruce. Bruce has put his hand up first. If you put them straight in the family trust, please. That's it. I've gone over, so no questions. We are, though, the other side of this wall. I'm here all day. We've also got a flyer. Can someone wave a flyer, please, Holly? Scan the QR code. Free consultation if you need anything. Thank you very much.